Hi guys, this is Nia and today I'm going to be doing something different. I recently published a new Skillshare class, but this time it's not on watercolors or painting as such, but rather bookbinding. And today I will be decorating one of the covers of the sketchbooks. The cover is made with plain dark brown faux leather. It turned out looking a bit too formal, so I decided to paint it. I know a dark brown background isn't the easiest to work with, so I chose to decorate it with earthy colored mushrooms to suit the brown. And since I will be painting on leather, I used acrylic paint instead of watercolors. I apologize if this isn't something you signed up for when you subscribed, but I will be back with watercolor tutorials next week. I love painting mushrooms and just thought that I would share this with you guys. I'll also be drawing it out, so maybe you guys can try painting it with watercolors instead. I will be painting 5 types of mushrooms. The first one, I did a painting tutorial on this before. This is the Agaric mushroom. I like including these because of the bright red colors and how it feels really magical. To draw this out, I'm going to make a rounded mushroom cap, and for the stem, I'm making the bottom rounded and a little bit fat. Then I'm going to add the white specks on top and also the ring or the skirt with just thin strokes. Later when I painted, I did several different angles, and for some of the lower angled ones, I added some lines for the gills. You can make 3 different growth stages. For a young mushroom, the cap is still small and rounded with the bottom still closed up, and as it ages, the bottom opens until you're left with an oval cap. For the cap, I used a mix of rose madder and white, and for the stem, I used mostly white with a touch of yellow ochre, rose madder, and literally a tiny dot of Payne's Gray to mute the color a bit. I'm going to mention the colors just in case you want to also paint this with acrylics. I first mixed 2 light colors, and that's the light stem color and the red cap, but instead I'm going to turn that to pink. Most of my acrylic paints I have are quite transparent, so I want to do a few layers, and I'm mixing the first base color with a lot of white, so as I layer, the red will become more visible. The first mushroom is probably the more complex one, and it gets easier and simpler as I go on. I like to make this mushroom one of the main features, so as I paint and distribute it, I want to place this one first, and the last couple will be used as filler mushrooms. For all of these mushrooms combined, I will only be using 5 colors, and that's titanium white, deep yellow, rose madder, and yellow ochre, and also Payne's Gray. For the composition, you can combine 2 or 3 mushrooms together and bunch it up. It's really up to you. I like to do a couple of those ones just for variety. I like to work with 1 color at a time, and because I want this as a clean pattern, I try as hard as possible to create clean lines straight away with the paint, and always rotating my sketchbook whenever I need to get better brush control. By the way, I'm sorry that I have to speed this up. Acrylic is a much slower medium compared to watercolors, so I have around 2.5 hours of footage for this, but I'll try to give as much information as possible in the limited time. The great thing about acrylics is that they dry out quite quickly, so I can paint on them straight away, and this time I'm using more red than the white, and I'm just going to continue adding more of the rose madder as I layer until I'm happy with the saturation. I'm adding the 3rd layer now, and hopefully you can tell that the color is a bit more pronounced. I'm going to mix up a darker version of the color for the stem to use for the area of the gills, so the stem looks separated from it. I'm going to add more of the same colors I used for the stem, which is the yellow ochre, a little bit of rose madder and a tiny bit of the Payne's Gray and slowly mix it into the lighter stem color until I get the shade that I want. And then that is going to go below the cap where the bottom is a bit exposed. Then I'm going to add a bit of the lighter stem color into the previous color we just mixed because I felt like the initial first layer was a bit too light. For the white scales on the cap, I'm going to take a tiny dollop of white and I'm going to paint dots around the caps of the mushroom, and I'm painting more dots near the top of the cap, and as it slowly gets to the bottom, I'm going to put less and less dots. To finish everything off, I'm going to add lines to represent the skirt using a darker brown. So I'm going to add a bit of the yellow ochre and also the Payne's Gray. And then I'm also going to add lines for the gills. And for that, I'm just going to use white. Moving along to the second mushroom, I'm going to paint yellow wood mushrooms. These are usually attached to tree barks and it has a yellowish cap. For the cap, I'm actually just going to draw a strange yellow shape. It's a bit wiggly, I guess, and as it comes to the sides, sometimes it gets a bit thinner. I'm not going to draw the stems, but rather just the gills straight away, and for this, I want the shape to be made with two concave lines, which comes into a smaller flat point at the bottom. You can also pile them on top of each other depending on the composition that you're looking to do. For this, I want the top to be a warm yellow color, and like the first mushroom, I first started with a mix of white with the yellow deep for the base color, and I'm going to use the same base stem color as the previous mushroom for the gill area. Then as I made the second layer, I'm going to add more yellow into the mix, but I felt after doing this that the yellow wasn't warm enough, so I just kept going. But for the third layer, I decided to add a touch of rose madder into the yellow mix, just a little bit so it turns a bit more golden, and I think I'm happier with the hue this way. So this is where I added a bit of the rose madder. I only added a tiny little dot so the yellow becomes more orangey instead, and I feel like this goes better with the brown and the red. And here I'm going to keep the gill color quite light, so I'm just going to use the same color and make the second layer. Then for this one, I'm just going to finish off with the gills and use the same color just in different ratios. So it's a mix of rose madder, some yellow ochre, and Payne's Gray, but this time with only a tiny bit of white so the brown becomes darker. And that's it for the second mushroom. Moving along to the third mushroom, I'm going to be drawing out button mushroom, which is probably the most common mushroom we eat. I love how round and cute they are, so I decided to include them in the pattern. To draw them, I'm going to make an oval for the cap. Then for the stem, I'm going to keep them short and rounded. If you want to draw out a low angle and expose the gill area or the bottom of the cap, all you have to do is add more of the stem across the cap area and add a smaller oval at the bottom of the cap for the gill area. For this mushroom, I want it to be a warm gray color, so I'm going to use white with some Payne's gray, but this time I added a touch of rose madder and a little bit of yellow ochre to create a warmer tone of gray. I'm going to start by painting an oval on the areas where I want the button mushrooms to be. So like before, I'm just spreading it around the page. You can always go back to it later if you want to add more for final touch-ups. After I'm done with the oval, then I added the short stems attached to the oval using the exact same color. After that, like before, I'm going to build on the layers until I get the opaque finish. The most tricky thing about doing this is probably smudging or getting paint in areas that you don't want to. I ended up getting some paint on the bottom of the cover, and by the end of it, it was a bit too late because it's already dry. So if you're doing this, go slowly and make sure your hands doesn't have paint on it like I did, but I didn't want to keep wiping my hands every so often while filming. Anyway, getting back to the button mushrooms, after the paint looks nice and opaque, I'm going to add the gills. I made the same color as the button mushroom, but with a tiny bit of white only, so a dark version of the same warm gray, and I'm going to paint the bottom of the cap an unfinished oval shape. For the fourth mushroom, I'm not sure what this is, maybe a shiitake mushroom? It's just an ordinary mushroom, I guess. The cap is similar to how I've drawn the fly agaric mushroom, but a bit rounder, and for the stem I'm using the same shape as the button mushroom, so somewhat a rounded rectangular shape, but I'm keeping it short and stubby. For this, at first, I used the same color as the gill area of the button mushroom for the cap of the shiitake mushroom, but as I was painting, I felt like the color was a bit too dark against the brown, so I ended up lightening it a bit for the top layer by just adding a touch of white. Anyway, I just left this one the way it is, but at the end, I kind of felt like it looked too boring, so I used the white button mushroom color again to add a bit of shine on the cap with a curved line and a dot later on. And we're finally onto the last mushroom. This is also a very simple one. I had no idea what these are called since I just see them a lot, and I decided to use that type of mushroom, but I searched it and it's apparently called alias mushroom. And for this, I just draw a tiny mushroom cap. I'm going to draw it as a rounded triangular shape. Then for the stem, I'm just going to draw out a thin line. And because these are tiny, thin mushrooms, I decided to paint them in bunches and use individual ones to fill in some gaps at the end. For the colors, I used a mixture of the rose, yellow deep, Payne's gray, and a little bit of white to create a light brown color for the caps of the mushroom. Again, for this, I'm just going to start painting the caps first, and where the areas are quite large, I'm going to draw like a whole bunch of them. But if they're tiny areas but you feel like you can squeeze in a mushroom, I'm just going to paint maybe one or two of them. And of course, I'm just going to layer them again until the colors are nice and opaque. For the stem, I'm going to mix a little bit of yellow ochre with some white. And for this, I'm just going to draw really thin lines. as thin as I can. You can also switch with a smaller brush, but I just wanted to use one brush because I'm too lazy to swap around since it's the last mushroom anyway, so I just tried to use the tip of my brush to get as thin line as possible. After I'm done, I had a look around again to see if there are any spaces I can still fill. So if you think that you can still add a bit more mushrooms, you can add wherever you need to. At this point, this is where I thought the shiitake mushroom was a bit too boring, so I added some shine to it with a curved line and a dot. And yeah, so that's the finished cover. And before I go, I want to talk to you about my new Skillshare class. I know some people asked me to make a tutorial on how I make my own sketchbooks, and I was thinking about doing that, and I felt like it was way too long to be made into a YouTube tutorial after thinking about it, so I turned it into a Skillshare class instead. To make my sketchbook, I usually divide it over 3 days to make it if the task becomes too overwhelming, because there are some tedious things that you do have to do, or you have to wait for glue to dry and stuff like that. So if I were to finish it all in one day, I wouldn't enjoy the process as much. So this is around maybe 5 hours of footage that I've broken down into 1.5 hours of class. And if you're still wondering how I make my sketchbooks, maybe you can join the class if you're already a member. I know I made it sound unappealing, but bookbinding does take some time to complete. I don't want anyone going into it thinking that it's just going to be a quick project, but having finished binding and creating your own sketchbook does give you a great feel of accomplishment later on, and it's something that you'll definitely use anyway. I forgot to mention that the class also focuses on using ordinary craft supplies, no book presses needed, and things like that. I also tried to mention substitute optional supplies in the class, so hopefully everyone will be able to make their own without having to buy new supplies and tools that you won't be using that often. If you're not a member of Skillshare yet, I will leave a link in the description box which can give you a free 2-month subscription to Skillshare. So you get to try out Skillshare, and you get to also check out my class if that's something you're interested in. So that's the finished cover. I hope you still enjoyed this video even though it's not on watercolors. Sometimes it's nice to go back into other mediums though. But don't worry, if this is not your interest, I will get back to watercolors again next week. Anyway, if you're still here, thank you for watching till the end, and I will see you at the next video. Bye!